but also the person it's trying to stop is me. Like I'm the guy who in the olden days would be, I always have ideas. I've got a zillion ideas. I could totally coach somebody like, hey, what do you want to do? What about this? It's to shut me up. It's to keep me from prompting them. I don't want to be talking. I want them to contribute something.
Welcome to the Red Caps Podcast, the podcast where we dip our caps into the blood of our listeners and we ramble on about old school games. Today I sit down with Ben Robbins, the creator of Microscope, Kingdom, In This World, and a bunch of other really great games. He's also really well known for his West Marches campaign that brought that style of play into popular discussion. Him and I sat down, we had a great chat that went by way too quickly. I'm going to have him come back on the show because there's so much more to talk about. But for this particular episode, I hope you can all sit back, listen, and enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm joined by Ben Robbins. How are you doing today, sir?
Doing great. How is everybody out there? And there's no answer, of course.
No, the void just sits back and stares at us.
It's so unfair. We talk and they just don't reply. It's so impolite.
I asked you to come on because I know you for a couple of key things that we'll get to those in a minute. But before we get to the stuff that I know you for, and I'm sure most of the people that are going to end up listening to this know you for, I want to ask a couple of things that I don't know you for. So, like, you're a game publisher. Is that your primary gig, or do you have a day job? What is Ben Robbins when he's not contemplating the problems of the gaming world?
Yeah, it's I used to have a day job. I transitioned quite a while ago, actually, now to full-time. And basically, if you were looking through like the spy camera into my house and you saw me just like going about my day, you would see me just looking like a normal person. But deep inside my brain, it's just constant. It never stops. It never stops. I'm just constantly thinking about the game stuff and how to make it better and what are the issues. And just it is an unceasing thing. It is an all-consuming, full-time passion. Obsession? I don't know. Yeah, it's just endless. Yeah.
And what did you escape from to come into this? What was the I no longer have to do that anymore because now I got to do this passion. Like,
well, there's I won't get into this too much because this is a funny story, but it's not relevant to our interest. Let's just say a long time ago I had a normal job, a very, very long time ago, and then I kind of accidentally lucked into being kind of more of a freelancer. And I was a freelancer doing like computer consulting for like a long time, like 15 years. And that was what I was doing before I just ditched that as well and became a game designer full time. But the key, so hey, shout out to people who are fellow game designers. The advantage that taught me was that I was already used to insecurity. I was used to things being unpredictable and to not really knowing where my next dollar was coming from. And that's great if you're a game designer because that's exactly what you're getting into. So I had little fear of risk long before I went full-time game design. So
yeah, I also work in the IT space and have worked with countless consultants and contractors, what have you. And they all kind of have that same, you can tell the folks that it's their very first time doing like their very first contract. And then you look at the seasoned vets who have been doing it for ages, have been rolling through contracts. And yeah, the fear of, even the healthy fear that like a normal full-time employee has, where they're like, oh man, I hope I don't get laid off or what have you.
Yeah.
It just doesn't exist with some of those individuals. The self-confidence is there. And also I've seen this story before. I know how it'll all work out.
And it's also, I mean, like, not to get pretty dark, but I mean, like, let's face it, it's security. There's a certain illusion to it. Like you have a job, you think you're secure, but then any moment something could happen. I mean, you could lose that job. You do have to be able to kind of roll with the punches just in life in general. So that's my upbeat note for the day, everybody.
Hey, we start here and then we're going to climb. I promise.
It's going to go up. We're going to go up. All positive after here.
So when you were working at the day job, or even now when you're doing your new day job now, what's the big hobby outside of gaming? So whenever you want to step away from there, I was just mentioning before we jumped on, hockey's one of mine. What's your big outside of the game hobby?
I find what I really do to relax from gaming is more gaming. No, I'm not even kidding. Like I really try really hard not. I'll answer this question as a serious one first, but I really try hard not to make it a business, not to make it like I've known a lot of people who've been in game design who've gone into like professional game design, like bigger companies, whatever, and you can see them not having so much fun with it and thinking of it in a more, it's a business transaction, right? And I can see the fun leaching out of their body. And I actively fight that with like every fiber of my being. I try to play games and just play the games, just really still enjoy them and love them. Outside of that, like I live in Cape Cod now, so I'm pretty much just like, look, the ocean, going in the ocean. It's a day of the week. I'm going in the ocean. I'm looking to get eaten by a shark. This is my prophetic statement. If by the time this releases, I've been eaten by a shark, I have no one to blame but myself. No one to blame. Yeah. 100%.
I grew up around the ocean as well. That was actually probably, so if you're in Cape Cod, almost directly due north of you in Canada, in the Maritimes, where I grew up. But yeah, there is a certain nicety about when the weather's good, just being able like, I'm going to go down and sit on a beach for a while.
Yeah. Or jump in the water and splash around the waves, even when it's like freezing cold. Like I'm doing it anyway. I don't care. I'm doing it. So
the games that you publish are published underneath the name of Lame Mage. Where did Lame Mage come from?
Well, that's got really two. I know, just to be clear to the audience, I didn't know what any of these questions are. These are off the top of my answers are off the top of my head. None of these prepared. Okay, so here's the honest answer. So there's two stories about that. One is that we were in college. A buddy of mine, I had this D&D character from like my childhood. I was like, I'm gonna play my D&D character. I always get to be the GM, and it was this high level wizard I had for a million years. And my buddy who was going to run the game was like, oh my God, I'm going to make a game for Ben and his Lame Mage. And that was the kind of the joke, was like this Lame Mage quip that he made off the cuff. So that was like kind of the light humorous reason for it. And the other is kind of my dad, who's passed away now, who was a teacher all his life. He was born with a clubfoot. And in the technology of that time, their solution to that was to cut off your leg. So as a tiny child, I told you the fun stuff. We're getting into the fun stuff. You guys are here for gaming. So he had a wooden leg, and I mean literally a wooden leg his entire life. And so in a way, the kind of the Lame Mage is kind of a bit of also an homage to him, which I never talk about. I never bring that up, but you asked, so I'm telling you. So.
No, that's really cool because you've got kind of like the funny, lighthearted side of it, but there is a more personal side of it, which I think is important. It makes the name meaningful to you, and if you don't want to bring up that side of it, you have the. I usually
don't bring that up, but today's a special day apparently. So.
So Lame Mage has a bunch of different games underneath it. I'm most familiar with. I don't know if you would call it your most famous game, but Microscope is the one that I'm most familiar with.
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah.
And then of course the other thing that I know of you for is West Marsh's talk. Are the two big things that I'm like, oh, when I heard your name, I'm like, I know that name for these reasons. But Lame Mage has a bunch of other games other than Microscope. And for those who maybe don't know Microscope, how would you classify the games that you publish underneath there? Because there is a kind of a theme amongst most of them.
Yeah, I think that the big picture is the games are all about what if all the fun stuff that you do in like a role-playing game is when you're the GM, when you're making up the world and doing all that stuff, the stuff that I love doing for decades. What if we did that together at the table in a productive way? Not just like, hey, let's just make up stuff randomly. But if the game guided us to create surprising and interesting environments together. And some focus, like Microscope, is much more on the world building side. And then some of the other games are like Kingdom, for example. We make this community together, and now we're going to set it in motion. We're going to see the characters actually in conflict over the setting, fighting to make the place that they are all part of be what they want it to be. So they're all just kind of like different gradations on we've built a setting together, and now we're going to explore what that means. And then like a weirder, Microscope is the weirdest, definitely. And then like In This World, which is a new one, is also another very weird one in the sense that there's no characters, there's nothing. It's just literally the raw reimagining the world around you, taking things in the world you want to think about, like, hotels, museums, law enforcement, and exploring how that could be different. And that's very much intentionally I wanted to inspire people to think, like not think things that I think, but just like think their own thoughts, like question things around them. because I think that's actually that's the part of the game that I really love, is that when people play together, they have ideas they didn't expect to have. Like, I sit down to play with friends, and like the stuff that comes out of our mouths during the game, I could not foresee. The things I come up with, I couldn't foresee. Like, I did not have this idea 10 minutes ago, but somebody else says something, and I riff off of that, and I'm like, oh wow, that's really cool. That's to me the fun of it, the spontaneous creativity that, like, a GM'd game, the games I played for decades, you as the GM fret so hard and plan ahead and make a setting and think of a story, and you have all this stuff preloaded, and you're so nervous whether it's good enough and whether it's, how much material do I have for this session. And the players kind of show up, and they listen to what you say, and then they add, they participate, they react. But ultimately there's this pre-built huge chunk of stuff. And my games, you could say, are the direct opposite. There's no preloaded anything. It all comes together right there in the moment between the players.
Yeah, what drew me to Microscope when I first saw it, and I can't remember, I wish I should have made a note of it, but I can't remember who it was. I first watched an actual play of it on YouTube or something, and I went, this is amazing. But what drew me to it is I've always considered, especially in older school games, like whenever I have discussions with people about, the newer generations of D&D versus the older generations, I've always said that the older generations of D&D, the world was the main character, not your character was the main character. The world was the main character. So Greyhawk or Blackmore or Mystera, that was the main character, and you were living in it and affecting it and what have you. But when you look back at the campaign overall, you're like, oh, look at this massive history of time that we went through and then the change we did. And Microscope was that without having the more granular side of it. It was with folks and just map that world out. And it was, I don't know, to me that was really, really cool. That was the beginning, the end. Let's fill in the middle aspect of it.
It's an amazing. I mean, I've been playing it now for a very long time, and it's still just kind of mind-boggling, to see the stuff that people come up with, and that the again, like you said, the surprises. Like we know the boundaries, and we're just filling in the middle. But it's amazing to see the creativity.
There's concepts that you have in the game that kind of, when I sit back and I look at it now versus when I first looked at it, there's things. So session zeros are always talked about in RPGs. Some people are very for them, some people are against them, what have you. I think in some manner everybody does one, whether they call it that or not. There's some sort of a, hey, this is what the game's going to be. But with Microscope, it's right at the very beginning of the game. You set up your palette, as you call it, which I thought was ingenious. Of like, okay, what are we and what are we not going to chat about in this game? I do it a lot in our interviews. You and I did it right before I hit the record here. I usually always ask somebody, hey, what do I not need to bring up during this conversation? But having that right up front, I think is really smart, and it's not done in a way that kind of beats anybody over the head with it, but it's almost done as a mini game in itself as well. Like I've played this, and people who know me, they're like, oh, Kevin's going to bring up this in the game. No, that's on the not allowed list, just so that I can't do it. They're my friends are screwing with me on it.
Right. But I think it's I mean, a couple things really interesting there. That's they're communicating with you when they do that. They're basically saying, you do this thing, and I'm not really into that thing. I'd like to do it a little bit differently. It's a way to kind of actually not just be grumpy at each other, and to be, because we all have our preferences. We all have things we like and dislike, and there's things that other people are into that I'm so bored with that. I don't want more mysterious aliens every game. Come on, stop doing that.
There will be no time travel.
There'll be no time travel, right? So it's just things that like someone else really likes, and it's such a great way to be like, hey, let's just talk about it. Let's get in the open. And what I find is really interesting too is sometimes I'll be like, normally I hate this thing. I don't like this trope or this idea. But you know what? Because we're talking about, I'll do it. Like for this game, I'll do it. I'll do the exact thing I don't normally like. I'll experiment a little bit. Why not? Because it's sort of a one shot. I can do it. And I think the other thing that's interesting about the palette is that really throws people is that people love being surprising. They love having like, I got a great idea and I'm going to surprise you all with my great idea. It's very natural human nature thing, right? To be like, boom, shocker. And the palette basically says, no, don't do that. Like tell us now the ingredients you want. You can surprise us with like the direction the story goes or how things turn out, but don't surprise us with content. Don't be like, surprise zombies. And I think that somehow people are really, they're surprised by the fact that they're not supposed to be surprising. But once you have discussion, you're like, yeah, no, don't. Like, let's narrow it down. Let's decide what we're going to talk about. And that, I think, because you're not surprising people with the subject matter, you're just surprising them with the within the boundaries we've agreed upon. It's a much more healthy surprise when people come up with cool ideas, because you're like, oh, that wasn't out of bounds. I embrace the thing you're doing. Instead of the normal thing where people are like, I don't know, should we have dinosaurs? I don't know, like mid-game where people would be like, what, dinosaurs? So again, the whole goal is to push those interactions into like a more healthy, fun space where people aren't like, grumbly.
Yeah, there's another thing that you have in there that I find interesting, and I don't remember if you ever addressed it in the book itself, but there's the concept that everybody has to take their turn, right?
Yes,
so like, it's your turn, you have to take your turn.
Yes.
How do you deal with the shy introverted or the passenger player? The player who comes to the table and they want to come in, hey, I want to roll some dice. No, we're talking Microscope. There's no dice here, but if it was a D&D session, I want to come and roll my dice. I will answer simple questions, but don't get me to dive into this type idea.
Yeah.
Right? How do you bring that person out of their shell to fully engage with a game like Microscope, where you kind of need to do a little bit more of that?
You are required to by the rules. You are literally, exactly like you said. The rules are very clear. You have to take your turn, and not only that, but the rules specifically say no coaching. You can't ask for ideas. That is against the rules. It'd be like if you're playing poker and you ask somebody, hey, look at my hand, what should I do? It's just against the rules. You just don't do that, right? It's just not allowed. And I'm a monster because yes, 100%, that knowingly puts people in the hot seat and says like, no, it's your turn. We're going to wait. And that's, I think, the thing is, it says, we want your contribution. It's an invitation. I want your contribution. I believe your contribution is going to be good, and we're going to patiently wait. If it takes a minute or two and you need to think, hey, that's cool. We'll just wait. It's fine. Most games aren't willing to do that. Most games will be like, hey, how can we keep things flowing and speed up or whatever? But the cost of not waiting is that you sometimes do have people who just never contribute or don't contribute very much. And the thing that I discovered really early on when I tried this alternative draconian structure of just requiring everybody to participate is that friends I had who I had gamed with for years, who I thought were cool, but were mostly quiet, they didn't want to do it. But when you were like, well, we got to wait for something, they would come up with something that they didn't think was that great, a minor contribution. And the rest of us were like, that's awesome. Like, I'm genuinely surprised by the ideas you're coming up with. And that's the point. Like, I want to be surprised by other people's input. And to see somebody you thought you knew coming up with like just really cool ideas, you're like, dude, you've been holding out on me all this time. Like you've been too quiet. So it is very intentionally trying to level the playing field. But also the person it's trying to stop is me. Like, I'm the guy who in the olden days would be, I always have ideas. I've got a zillion ideas. I could totally coach somebody like, hey, what do you want to do? What about this? It's to shut me up. It's to keep me from prompting them. I don't want to be talking. I want them to contribute something. And the other thing is, because of it's all like this interlocking puzzle, right? Because the nature of the game is that each piece gets built upon by everybody else. Even if they make something that they think is mundane and simple, that is a springboard for the rest of us. And then they think they added something that's not that exciting. 2 rounds later, we've all built so much on it, and they're like, oh my God, that idea I came up with is genuinely a fundamental part of this game. So it reinforces the idea to like, no, each person's contribution is necessary, vital, and desired, which is pretty cool. To be honest, like,
yeah, no,
cool.
It's really neat. It borrows from different, like, you see the kind of like the improv influence all over it as well.
Yeah.
And for anybody who has not played the game and you need the final selling
Oh,
point.
right, we should explain the game.
Actually, we definitely do that in a second. But here's a selling point for probably my audience. It heavily features index cards. So all those index cards that you have sitting there that you're just like, I need to use them, and you haven't made characters and put the characters on them yet. Take those index cards and go play Microscope. It's a great use of your index cards. But sorry.
And I think
sticky notes. And sticky notes.
I think one of the reasons it does so well is because, like, if you're a D&D player or whatever, this isn't competing with D&D. This isn't saying like,
this is
play D&D but play it differently.
This is making your prep fun. It's
It's a completely complementary activity, and it also, because it's so different, you don't fall into the trap of being like, oh wait, I'm used to role playing this way, I'm going to do that. It's asking you to do a totally different activity that normally the GM would be doing. And so I think it's very easy for people to play it and go like, oh, this is a different pastime, right? And not be confounded.
And it's not. I mean, we're talking in the realm of role playing, like traditionally, probably people who are familiar with D&D style games,
right?
But I've heard tons of people talk about Microscope, and they're coming from a literary background. They're coming from from an author standpoint. They're like, this helped me almost layout, or not layout. What's the word I'm looking for?
They charted their novel this way.
Yes, charted everything out. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Made the skeleton of what they want to do via the rule set that you have set up, because it kind of steps you through things in a way that lets the ideas flow out and go that way.
Yeah.
We were talking about how everybody has to take their turn. The other thing I like about it is that it forces you to kind of kill your darlings, or let go of them. Because I'm kind of like you, where I'll have this great idea and I'm thinking 6 steps ahead of my idea, but it's useless to do so, because if I think 6 steps ahead, nothing may be anything like that by that point. In fact, it may be completely countered to it. So I basically have to put the idea out and then let it die and see what it's like when it comes back around.
Yeah.
That idea.
Yeah. It really helps you embrace the idea of thinking on your feet. And when you have a great idea, like, oh, I want it to go this way, and then somebody does something else that clearly blocks what you had in mind, it's wonderful to just go like, well, that idea I'm just going to save in my head. That's a great idea, but that's not going to happen today. I'll save that for another game. But just the brain power, like a 2-hour game of Microscope feels like a workout, right? Like your brain is doing so much. You're like, you have to become very adaptable. You have to listen. You have to be like, well, if that's true, this is true. It requires so much kind of like engagement and willingness to be flexible about what happens next. But again, the kind of back to that yes and thing, the key bit is, though, you kind of already know a lot of the boundaries. You're not just like, oh, we're just making stuff up wildly. You're for the audience members who aren't familiar with it, because you start with the bookends. You start with like the big picture of the history, and you're kind of drilling to the middle, or like digging into more detail. The established facts cannot be changed, right? If we know the stellar empire expands and then collapses, it's gonna collapse. We can't change that. And knowing that that's the outcome actually gives you a lot of freedom, because you're like, oh, I don't have to fight over that. I know this planet's gonna blow up. I don't have to worry about that anymore. I can dig into why and how, instead of like most things, you're like, I'm fighting for an outcome. I'm fighting to prevent something from happening or make something happen. No. You probably already know what happened.
Yeah, I think a good, if you've never played Microscope before, and you're looking to, and you don't want to go and watch other people's plays on YouTube or what have you, take your favorite movie or book that you already know the plot to, and use the beginning and the end of that movie plot.
Totally.
And just be like, this is our start and beginning. Now we forget about the movie, but just now fill in the gaps in between what you've bookended as the start and beginning of the movie.
Or even the other, like the classic, like, hey, let's redo Star Wars. Like you take the stuff and you say that's all true, but now we get to fill in all the blanks. Like there's the fun, or change some elements if you want. You can do the alt version of it. There's never, that's the thing. One of the things about the game is that you're never done. There's always more you could dig into and expose if you wanted to. You could end the game, but you could always just keep building into the nooks and crannies of the history.
Yeah, it's neat. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Harn.
Oh God, I played Harn.
So,
I got a hard story.
so what's neat about Harn for other people who don't know Harn, it's a setting, it's a game. I'm not a big fan of the game, but the setting itself is one of the most incredible settings that you'll ever go and find in gaming. But the way that they set it up is they've got a year, and at this year they will publish no further content from that point forward. They're only going to fill in the gaps of what happened before that point.
Oh, nice. So they're leaving like blanks for you to work with. Yeah.
Yeah. So like they do up the history up to a certain point, and then let's call that like day zero. Day zero onward is all players, but day zero backwards is where they can fill in stuff and they can flesh out their world however much they want.
Yeah.
So it's really kind of neat in that they know where their stopping point is, because we've declared that, hey, from this point forward, everything else is the players. But they can develop all the histories.
Now that you say that, in hindsight, that is weird. That if you think of things like Forgotten Realms or whatever, where it's like, hey, I pick up Forgotten Realms, I get the campaign, and then a couple years later, WotC or whoever comes out, they come up with a new thing and a whole bunch of events. And I'm like, well, that didn't happen in my campaign.
Exactly.
That's really obnoxious. Come to think of it, that's quite rude.
And that's what the glorious nature of Harn is that they've very early on they recognized that and they said, no, we will never do that. We will only ever flesh out stuff from beforehand. And I think it's kind of like what Microscope does, right? You've got a bookend, so you won't go past that point, but everything before then.
But it's also funny, now you're making me thinking about it, because like I'm picturing like 80s, game supplements before. I don't think there was so much of a concept back then of like, oh, here's the new release of Greyhawk and new events have happened. Like I think that was that kind of attitude of like, nope, the campaign setting is a static thing you get and you build on it. We're not going to update it with new current events was much more normal back in the day. I think like it's the shift to story, like Dragonlance later.
Exactly.
Shift to story.
Once you shifted to the novels and you had the Dragonlance sagas and yes, that's where this came.
Right. We blame Dragonlance. Good job, Dragonlance, bringing us into story.
Actually, that's a good little switch here. So, tell me the difference between, in your opinion, difference between traditional role-playing game and story games. So
I love this.
I
love this.
I come from the OSR background, and you will have a lot of people in that background that will kind of almost nose up in the air a little bit and use story game as a derogatory term. What is the difference between a story game or a traditional game? Because I'm telling a story in a traditional game.
Absolutely.
But in a story game, I'm not rolling dice typically, or if I am, it's a different way.
I think the first thing to kind of jump to is to recognize that a label isn't descriptive. Like when I say let's play basketball, like there is a basket involved, but it is not defined by the fact that any game with a basket is basketball. Baseball is not any game with a base, right? It's a word that we use to talk about something, and I think a lot of people get into but it said whatever, like role-playing game, for example. Let's get even further back. What is a role-playing game, right? People say, if I'm not role-playing a character, it's not a role-playing game, right? Because it's right there in the name. And I don't agree with that. I think I follow Vincent Baker, I think, is the author of this great definition of a role-playing game, which is pretty awesome, which is that a role-playing game is any game where for it to work, for it to proceed, we have to agree what is happening in the fiction. And that sounds a little slippery at first, but imagine, if you will, I'm playing Descent or something. The Descent game has all the rules, the pieces move around. It doesn't matter what I think about the fiction. I can see the state of the game right there, right? But if I'm playing D&D and the GM says, you go into a forest, and I don't agree I'm in a forest, things are going to collapse very quickly, right? We don't agree about the fiction. We might agree about this particular battle map that we're fighting on, but if we don't agree that we're in a city or that there's a king, purely fictional ideas, then the game stops. And I think if you take that definition, that really explains what we're doing at the table. Because if you say it's only about role-playing characters, then what have GMs been doing all this time, right? GMs, the vast majority of what they do is making worlds and imagining things and telling stories, even if there's not a single character involved. And to say that a GM is not playing a role-playing game is kind of bonkers. Like they're critical to this process, right?
Yeah, I think I would probably narrow it a tiny bit more. I would say that role-playing, at least in my opinion, is when you're making decisions that aren't based on yourself. So if I'm making a decision that's not Kevin making the decision, it's whether it's a nation state making that decision or it's Jim Bob, the farmer at, some tiny town making the decision. As soon as I'm making decisions not for myself, but for whether it be a character or for a nation or for something else, that's when I'm role playing.
But think of it this way. It's the distinction between role playing an activity and a role playing game, right? Like in a role playing game, you might not even be role playing for a big chunk. The GM is often not role playing at all. The GM is just right. The GM is making up.
GM would still be making decisions based.
But think of like you sit down and you make a world and you're making a forest and you're making all this stuff. You're not making decisions as any character. You're inventing things, right? You're doing this vast the stuff we just love as GMs, right? I'm making up history, I'm making up things. I might be envisioning characters in that story, but I might also be making up a big black obelisk, right? That obelisk has no role-playing element to it. So I think a role-playing game, the thing we do together is we imagine together, right? Ultimately, we imagine together. If we can't imagine together, nothing else happens. And then within that, there is role playing, which is a specific activity where I make decisions as my elf ranger, right? And I think again the words trip us up, right? And I think it's funny too that like in the old days, historians check me on this. TSR didn't even call it a role playing game; they called it adventure games, right? Adventure games was the word they used all the time.
Fantasy adventure games or fantasy.
Exactly. But I think, and so again, I think like the specifics. If we erased all the labels, if we pretend there's no labels, and we just say start from scratch, what are we doing? People wouldn't really disagree. They'd be like, yeah, we imagine together. That's what we do. And then in the imagine together, I have a character. Yeah, but in a particular pattern. Like if we can't agree about the make believe, the game stops. I have a character make decisions for my character. The games make up the world. Like nobody disagrees about what it is we're doing. They just disagree about what words we call it by, which is unfortunate. I think it's a waste of our time. Like we should be focusing on what's really happening. What do we do?
Right, but I think the reason why we have labels is because we do those things in different ways. So, music is music, but I definitely prefer, heavier or rock or what have you music to say country music, or I like folk music, but I'm not a huge fan of opera. So it's all music, definitely.
But imagine someone's like, what is music? It's like we're literally saying, we're not even saying what is types of music. We're saying what is music. Is what you're doing. If a guy is hitting a stick on a trash can, that's not music. That's really the discussion of like what is a role playing game. Okay, but to answer your actual question, because I had to zoom out and be like, this is worse than you think. The story games versus other types of role playing games, right? Different people totally disagree. So in my mind, this is what I think of as story games versus adventure games. And this is a very precise definition. A lot of people say, oh, it's a game focused on story or whatever. That's not what I think it is. Here's the acid test that I think you can use and absolutely know what's up. If you're playing a story game, or let's say there's two types of games. In one type of game, your character determines what you can do. If my thief is good at climbing walls, I am more likely to successfully climb a wall. If I am a strong character, I can do strong character things. I can pick up a boulder, right? In what we'll call story games, but again, we can call whatever we want, doesn't matter. The traits of your character are not the limitation on what happens. If I think it's interesting for my character to sneak into the wizard's tower, it is more likely to happen because I'm interested in that happening. And it might even be that I think in my head, like, yeah, because my character's strong, but there's not a middle layer of mechanical traits of a character limiting that thing. And that sounds really weird, but it rapidly becomes clear because with a story game, then you're saying, I as a player think this makes sense. Therefore, it is more likely to happen. Whereas in a D&D game, it does not matter what I think makes sense. If I don't have the strength stat to like pry open the bars, I just can't do it. The GM can be like, oh, sure, hand wave it, but the GM is the only one that can do that, right? My desires are not the key factor in a traditional adventure game, and that's fine. There's no problem with that. But it's such a fundamentally different thing, right?
Yeah, it's one is more of a simulation. The other one seems more of a dream state. So
or even just like dream, like just storytelling from the point of view of like I am saying what I'm interested in. I think it would be more interesting if I fall down that well. I think it'd be more interesting if and here's the thing, you can have tons of mechanics around it. I might have a whole pool of dice as a player that I can spend or use or tokens or whatever. I could have very mechanical limitations on my ability to make something happen, but it's not character stats, right?
Right.
It's not, if my character is tied up in a D&D game, if my character is tied up in a basement, I am tied up in a basement. There's nothing I can do about that. In a story game, if I'm tied up in a basement, that's just a fictional state that I can be like, well, what's interesting to go with from there? I don't have to like roll to escape the ropes. And it's not based on my ability to escape ropes. It's radical and weird.
No, it makes sense. Sorry, I just was sitting there thinking. Now I was trying to come up with a funny way of countering you're tied up.
No, here's another point though. So you think of games that have things like hero points or bennies or any kind of a meta currency, right? What that is a tiny step in the direction of being a story game. You're saying, yeah, your character can't do that, but you as a player can spend a point to like, hey, make it more likely. You're kind of, and so it's like a gradient rather than just like an absolute continuum, right?
Right.
You're shifting a little more towards like, what does the player want to have happen? The character doesn't spend those points, right? That's the meta currency is in the player's hands, not the character's hands. You're using that to overcome your character stats. So you're kind of like, you're doing a little, and again, we'll use the word story gaming because that's where we started, but a lot of people actively don't think that's what the word story game means. And so whatever. But in the world at large, I think those are two ways to play these kind of games. And they're not good or bad. They're just radically different points of view about how to do it. And here's like, I did West Marches, right? I love tactical combat. I loved simulation, like, hey, die in the wilderness, too bad. Yep. You're starving, the wolves are coming for. I love that. But I also love the other thing. And I recognize that if you don't know which one you're doing, you're going to be very sad. You're going to have a bad day.
which I think goes back to a little bit what we mentioned before in terms of setting expectations up front.
Yes.
I think that's important. So I sold everybody earlier on your games by saying, hey, they're going to use up all your index cards.
Yes.
But the flip side to that is that they're gonna have to put away all their dice, which you might lose everybody now. They're not gonna be able to use their fancy math rocks.
It's weird. I don't know why. I don't know why that is. I don't know why there's no dice in my games. I don't know why. It's weird.
So what's with the lack of RNG? So when you remove the randomness out of it, and you're making it strictly from what's coming from your mind, a lot of folks might turn around and say, well, where's the game aspect then? A lot of people equate the randomness or the fact that there's things that happen outside of your control as what makes it a game.
And one would argue they're dead wrong.
Because there's no RNG to chess, and chess is a game.
Or basketball, right? Like there's
RNG to basketball because that ball might bounce strangely or do something funky. There might be a gust of wind, but
a gust of wind, sure. But ultimately, the greatest randomizer is other people. Right. There's nothing more random than other people. And I think you don't see that as much in like D&D because the choices the players get to make are much more limited. Like I don't get to just make up part of the country if I'm playing D&D. I just decide what to do in the bottom. I saw what my character system does. I'm in this body, this one person, right? I only have so much ability. The more creative control you give to individuals, the more their unexpected contributions have a massive impact. Nothing is more random than a person, and like I said, the more you let them contribute, the more you see that. And also, it is true. Like I do have some randomness in some of my games. Like there's like the finger voting in Kingdom. Follow famously has actual randomness, like it has, but the randomness is very intentionally incredibly weighted. It's randomness based on our interpretations of what's happening. Like you put stones in a cup and draw from them, but the stones you put in are things like, hey, how well do you think this quest is going? Do you think it should put in 1 or 2 stones? So all the players are setting the odds individually, right, without knowing what they're all going to say. So our actual odds of success at a particular thing are reflections of our opinions of how things are going. But then it's totally random. But then you should draw. So But yeah, I don't know. I think dice just seem too easy. It's always the easiest thing in the world is always to say, if we don't agree, we both just roll a d6. Famously, Major Wesley and Bronstein, the first one would argue the first role-playing game before D&D, right before Blackmore. He was playing with some guys, and I think it was Dave Arneson actually got in a duel with another player's character, and was basically like, "We're going to get in a duel. We're going to get in a sword fight." And they turn to Major Wesley and they say, like, who wins? How do we resolve it? And Major Wesley's like, well, both of you roll a d6, see who rolls higher. There's nothing easier than saying, let the dice decide. The problem is the dice don't know what's going on. The dice are unaware of what's cool in this situation. The dice don't have good taste. And let's face it, as players, we believe the dice are controlled by magical gods who understand karma.
What do you mean by believe?
I'm just saying. I mean, it's true. I'm not arguing it's not true. I got stories. I got 100% stories. This is it. This is why I don't use dice. I respect them too much. I respect the dice. No, I'm serious. I come from an old D&D background. The whole, like, the dice, like, that die is bad, I don't use it.
Well, actually, no, that's a really good point of what you're just saying there in terms of respect the dice is I've had people, when I have conversations with games, and especially with when they're talking about older school games, and they're berating my character doesn't have a good enough chance of doing this, or my stats were too low, or the balance wasn't there. And I'm like, why are you rolling for things that you shouldn't need to roll for? Like,
totally.
Like, don't roll unless you're willing to accept the results of the dice. So if you're the type of person, or if your table can't accept the fact that this dice might come up and say, sorry, you died, don't roll that dice. Now, that might also mean you don't play this particular game. Maybe this game system isn't the best suited for you, but almost any of these games can be played, and you don't need to roll the dice every 3 seconds. You roll it.
No, 100% old school. Like, there's I got like 7 answers to this, right? One, old school, you weren't rolling perception rolls, right? You were in a dialogue with the GM, you were like, hey, what do I see? And the GM tells you, and you ask questions, and there was no perception roll. You were not rolling to, like, I mean, there was a listen at doors check was the closest you could get, but it was a dialogue about the fictional world, not just dice. But then, in addition to that, I mean, there's the whole like, say yes or roll the dice kind of logic, which is great. But then, to really answer the thing you're talking about, the rolling the dice thing and let's face it, the GM decides. The GM says, hey, roll the dice. And I've known GMs who are great people and I love them, but they definitely are doing the, like, I don't know what should happen here. Roll some dice, and hopefully the dice will give us a conclusive answer. They want like a 1 or a 20. Like, I don't know, maybe you're going to succeed. They're hoping for a big answer, and then they'll be like, oh, awesome. The dice clearly showed that you got captured by the guards. But then they get a 12, and they look at the dice and they go, well, I don't know what that means. And they're stymied. They really need a coin flip. A coin flip would be so much clearer of a, like, if you want the dice to tell you an outcome, you want a diametrically clear yes, no, not it's an 11, it's a 9. And then the worst is when the GM's like, well, somebody else roll or roll again. You're like, guys, come on. Now we're in the morass. Like, could we have just flipped a coin? Because we're kind of just in the weeds now. We called upon the dice gods for an oracle, and they gave us nothing. And now we're sad and we're demoralized, and we're like, ugh.
So after that happens and they're out there, I'm going to switch our conversation again.
Yeah.
They now got to get back to base, because we're now going to talk about a West Marches campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've gone out, they've done their thing. They got to get back to base.
Mm-hmm.
West Marches is such a cool concept. It was a cool concept years ago. It still gets talked about today. You get credited a lot around this, and it's been talked about by every person underneath the sun. Of all of the different people who have taken different takes on this, or have added to it, or critiqued it, or twisted in some ways, who or what has been added to it or talked about it that made you go, holy crap, I never thought about that, but that's bang on. That's how you probably should be done.
It's weird. I actually don't follow it that much, because, like, I kind of stopped doing GM games that much after a while, and I kind of I did it. I played the game. I wrote the blog post, like, I'll write this blog post up. This might be fun. Kind of didn't look, and then, like, surprised, people are talking about it a bunch, and then I kind of didn't pay attention, and then kind of years went by, and somebody would be like, "Hey, can I use the name?" And I'm doing a podcast. Can I use that name? I'm like, "Yeah, sure, of course." That's what it was called. And then I wouldn't really notice, and then I turned back around, and suddenly there's like swarms of people talking about it. I'm like, "That's weird." And friends of mine that played in that game are like, "You know what's weird? Like people talk about our campaign all the time. That's weird." I'm like, "Yeah, that is weird." So I don't know. I don't know if I'm really following the discourse exactly. The only thing that gets me is that sometimes I think people use the phrase West Marches interchangeably with like any sandbox game, which isn't really accurate, right? West Marches has got a very specific set of kind of like credos that you have to kind of follow for it to matter. So I think then it flips around people too. People are like, "Oh my God, we had sandbox games before that. This guy didn't do that sandbox games." I'm like, "Yeah, I know. I didn't say I did. Like, come on, don't be crazy."
There's things from that blog post that I think are iconic, that I've stolen. Like I literally like read it and went, "Oh, I'm stealing this no matter what game it is."
That's the point. That's the point.
The key one, probably like the number one, probably for me, was the table map.
Yeah.
When I first read it, I was like, "That is."
It was so
like,
good.
Story-wise, and just being able to encourage people to actually take mapping and notes and what have you. I mean, some people would do that naturally, but you'd always have games where nobody did, and they come back
Yeah,
2 sessions later and never remember anything. But the whole idea of like, hey, you've got a shared table here that everybody's going to contribute to. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic.
And the weird thing too is this is like before we played this game in like 2001 to 2003. So it was like before even like, oh, everything's online was a thing. Exactly. People had email, but that was about it, right? Some people had websites, but generally it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. So it was literally like a bunch of pieces of paper taped together that got brought to sessions, and people were like, "Oh, wait, let me get the big pieces of paper out." People would scribble on it. And it's weird, like some people are like, "Wow, where'd you get the idea?" Like, I don't know. It was just like an off the cuff, "Hey, this is great, let's do this." And exactly right. It was like it's the best possible way to solve that problem. Like in hindsight, like perfect, great solution.
And I think part of what makes the blog post and the whole idea of that campaign resonate with people, at least if you're a GM, or what rang true for me, was the way it handles scheduling. So the way it instantly says the hardest part of anything to do with gaming is getting people together.
Yeah.
And basically he said, "Yeah, well, stop worrying about that then. Make them worry about it."
Yeah. Yeah. And also be realistic. Like people, we're adults. People have lives. Like people have kids. You gotta roll with the punches. You can't just be like, "No, game night is sacred." You gotta live in the real world. And I think the idea that like different people have different availability. Like some people would be like, "That can play all the time." Some people's like, "I can play once a month." Let's have space for both of you. Let's give both of you room to be involved. But let's be honest, it's not all smooth sailing. Like there's jealousy. People feel like they're missing out. That's a natural human reaction. So you try to mitigate that as much as you can, but it can be a beast. The more people love it, the more it can be negative, right?
You bring up a really good point, and it's when all these games, whether you want to call them story games or role-playing games,
right?
Whatever
the stuff we love, the fun stuff we love.
Let's play imagination together.
Yeah,
it's all the entire game centers around what doesn't matter whether you're using dice or index cards or what have you. It's communication. We're talking to each other.
Yeah,
and for a set of games that requires so much communication, and as often, at least in many cases, you're playing with peers, whether that's other adults or if you're younger, you're playing with other people of your same age group, generally speaking. Having that communication back and forth, it's astounding to me how often that communication just isn't happening. Whether it's around things like, "Hey, I got to take my kid to a hockey game. I'm going to miss tonight," or, "Hey, you know what? Can you please put on some deodorant?" Or
"Hey," or I hate the thing we're doing. I don't like the direction this game is going, or all that stuff.
Like I don't understand how as a group of people we've managed to have things like /r/RPG horror stories where people. I'm personally convinced that 99% of those is fan fiction. Fan fiction rage bait, essentially. But the fact that there must be at some point some deep panels of that, there has to be some nugget of truth, that people are so inability they don't have that ability to communicate.
I have an answer for this, and this is not going to be a popular answer. And I say this with love, or maybe not with love, but this is okay. Putting on my like thinking hat, I thought about this a while ago, and I think it's really not complicated. It's very straightforward. That since the dawn of time in D&D, and okay, so to be perfectly clear, I GM'd like 100% of the time from like 1980 to 2005 or so, right? So 25 years, whatever, mega GM. Like I'm all about GMing. This is my whole thing, right? And it was only even after 2005 that I started transitioning away from that to being more into the GMless stuff. So I got the credentials, right? I played Bronstein with Major Wesley. I was a counselor at Chippensburg Adventure Game Camp in the 80s. Like I've been in the trenches.
I've seen some stuff, man.
I've seen some things. But here's the thing: if you actually look at the dynamic at the table of play, the reason we don't have those conversations is because in every game, every D&D game, every game, GM game, there is a GM, and the GM owns the game. The GM is the responsible authority figure who controls the game, and we defer to them. And because we do that, there's pros and cons of this. So I'm going to say the bad stuff, and then I'm going to point out the good stuff. We kind of put it on them to resolve problems. If they decide who to kick out of the game, they decide who to invite to the game, right? Like, and that's weird. That's weird on its face that one person decides who shows up and who doesn't show up, right? And I'm sure there's groups that don't do that, but that's like the norm in our society of gaming, right? It's the GM's game. They decide what we're playing. They decide what our characters should be like. Again, there's variability. If there's a problem person, as a player, I don't like intervene. I let the GM intervene, and that's weird. And I think that is by having that person in the position of authority, the teacher in the room, it has prevented us as a game society from developing the skills to talk to each other and say, I don't like the thing you're doing. Like we've been held back by this having one authority figure. Now, the bonus of that, the plus side, is that if I just want to show up to play, I'm off the hook. Like there's this other person who's going to manage this stuff, and I just get to have fun. That's a bonus. And if someone's being a jerk, I don't even have to deal with it. I can be like, that guy's an idiot. It's the GM's job to handle these two people fighting. I'm just over here having a beer. I'm cool, right? So there's pros and cons, but I think that is exactly why for the decades we've had role-playing games, it's why you see these horror stories still on Reddit or whatever, right? Because people are saying, I'm not talking about the players, but I'm talking to you, the internet, because there's this one central figure whose job it is to police everybody. And you get into GMless games where theoretically there's still somebody who's like, well, maybe I'm facilitating the game, maybe I'm teaching the rules, maybe I have higher social clout, whatever, than the other people for whatever reasons. But ultimately, we are all in together, and people do kind of have to hash out their stuff with each other, and you can't escape dealing with that stuff. You do communicate. You have to communicate. I'm just saying, where else in life do you have that situation? You know,
that's what I bring this up often whenever in the cycle when people spin the wheel of, hey, what RPG topic is going to dominate social media for the next day or two, and it lands on one of the same themes that comes up over and over.
Right.
When the same conversation comes up, this is where I bring all this up. I'm like, why can't we just have conversations?
Yeah.
Like, I get that the tools are there for what they're there for, but almost every single scenario that you're talking about where you need to have this tool can be solved if you just treated the other person like a human and you just talked.
But if I'm in a game, here's the thing. This is a thing. This is ripped from the headlines. This is a thing that's happened to me recently. If I'm in a game and there's a GM, I'm also constantly like, I don't want to overstep. I don't want to take authority away from the GM.
That's because you come from a long line of GMing, and you probably have this feeling where you're like, I don't want to show up the guy that I'm, or
totally.
the guy or girl that I'm playing with.
But I think players do too. Players are like, they're waiting to see what the GM says. It's our culture. Most players don't show up and be like, I'm just saying, I think the deferring to the GM is why we don't have the conversations that I think you think we should have. And I agree, we should be having like we'd be having so much more fun. And again, per West Marches, we should take that work away from the GM. The GM should be focusing on making the fun stuff and having the good time. They shouldn't have to be, the referee of interpersonal drama. Like, let us solve that, and let's balance it out a little more. Let the GM make the world. Let the GM play the game. Why burden them with scheduling and with social policing and with game creation and rules refereeing? They do everything. It's just not fair. Like, why are we putting all that on one person?
Yeah. See, the theme I've gotten from you, whether it be with the games you've published or the way that you talk about West Marshes or just our conversation here, the key takeaway I think everybody should take from this conversation is that we don't need GMs to do anything anymore. The players need to step up. You guys are
I'm
all
a bomb
lazy.
throwing anarchist.
Yeah. Stop being lazy players. Stop making the GM do everything, to the point where this man had to go and make games that didn't have GMs anymore. So you would.
But it's like it's the tough, like, I mean, we're in a bind, right? Like, as a player, you're like, well, what can I do to help? But you don't know what's allowed. And I think particularly nowadays, I mean, lots of people are set gaming groups. Tradition is a tough thing to change, right? If someone's like the forever GM, and then you see the forever GMs posting online, I'm burned out, I'm tired, I make these games and the players don't appreciate it, they won't tell me what's wrong. The GM suffers too. The GM's not being told the things they need to hear. It's just a shame. It's like it's fun, man. It should be a game. Let's have some fun. But I feel like this one baked in power dynamic has gone too far. And I think if you looked at, like, again, back to the history thing, right? If you looked at the way people GM'd in like the 80s, it didn't have the same dynamic. Remember the concept of like the caller, like where the GM would just be sitting back and being like, just
you figure out all your stuff, and one person come and tell me what happened, and I'll.
Yeah, way more healthy. Let the players, on my blog, I had a thing a long time ago, but the initiatives, instead of having individual initiative, you have group initiative, right? Like the party rolls for initiative, and this is like from ancient D&D, right? The party goes, then the GM goes. And because the party gets to decide who goes in what order, they have to talk to each other, right? It's the simplest fix ever. It's super easy, and yet it radically changes the feel of the game at the table. The GM just sits back and is like, hey, you 5 people, discuss, debate, argue, like, think who should go first. And the worst thing I see in D&D games is when the players never talk to each other because they're only interacting with the GM. And I'm like, what the hell's going on, right?
Off looking at their phone when it's not their turn.
Yeah, that's terrible. And I'm like, if you just literally the simplest trick ever, group initiative, and you will see your table transform overnight because it will have to, because they will have to talk to each other. They'll have to plan. They'll argue like, well, I should go first because I'm going to do this thing. And that's great. Let them hash it out, let them get engaged. Let them think this strategy through as a group,
So when we get off this conversation, and we get, we're talking on a Thursday evening here, we get to the weekend, I'm heading away on vacation. And then whenever I get back, the next week or so, I was planning on putting out a series of smaller, really short tips aimed at players. So most of my channel over the time, whether it's even conversations with folks like yourself, or even before when it was just me as a talking head, was more GM based. And I think that's the vast bulk of the advice you'll find anywhere on the internet is aimed at the GMs.
Yeah.
I want to do some that's aimed at the player. What would you say is the key tip you would give for somebody who wants to be a good player? They're coming in, they're coming in with the best of faith, but they don't know much. What's the one key tip to give to that player to make sure that they're contributing well to the group and having fun themselves?
I would say the easiest thing, ask questions. Ask questions of things the GM says, ask questions of things other player says. And I mean, real simple questions, just literal, like, okay, I was just playing a D&D game the other day, and we've been hunting bands of orcs, and then this group of orcs had a magician in it. And I was like, hey, is that normal? Have we seen that before? Like, should I be thinking that's weird that there's a magician in this group, or is that a normal thing? The GM was like, oh, no, that's normal. I was like, good, cool. Like it shows the GM you are paying attention, and you're learning more about the game. Again, it's straight from old school D&D. Engage and question. I don't mean question like, hey, that doesn't make sense. I mean question.
No, interrogate. Gather information. You're investigating. Be Batman and find out about the spot that you're in.
Exactly. And even just like use your eyes and ears in character to be like, oh wait, is this city, is it wealthy? Like, are there travelers coming through the gate? Does the Duke seem happy to see us? Real simple question, and the GM will love you for it, because you're basically, the worst thing as a GM is when you're just sitting there monologuing, and the players are just staring at you and they don't say a damn word. and you know that if you stop talking, the table's going to be dead silent, and this is your game, and now you're going to feel like a failure. And the players start asking you questions. You're like, oh, thank God. They were interested in what I'm saying. They're listening to me, right? And even things like asking about other characters, like a character says something or does something, I will turn to the other character and be like, oh, wait, like, do you just trust that guy? I'll try to get engaged with the other players because I want to hear their point of view too. I want to hear what they're interacting with. And suddenly you have like a fun, healthy thing instead of like a church meeting where everyone's dead silent, like a dead silent table with only the GM talking. No one likes that. The GM doesn't like that. You think the GM likes that? The GM doesn't want to be interrupted, like and like not paid attention to. But dead silence is no one's friend. It's not cool.
When somebody goes to lamemage.com and they look over the list of games that you've got there,
yeah,
which game, if you were to recommend somebody who hasn't played any of these games,
yeah,
somebody who is a D&D player, they've played D&D for ages,
yeah.
But 3 of the players from their group dropped out this coming Saturday. They're going to grab a Lame Mage game and play it with those who are there. Which game should they pick up and why? And I'm assuming that depends on the group dynamic, but
sure.
Pitch each of the games of which one they should be playing for which group.
Here's some good news. So the obvious one is to say, like, if you want something wildly different from like playing a normal game of D&D, having a character, obviously Microscope is a great one. In this world, if you kind of want to do brainstormy stuff. But here's good news. I kind of recently came to the conclusion that I wasn't doing nearly enough to spread GMless games or to kind of show people what was fun about them, right? I was failing in that regard. So I came to a decision very recently, actually, to take one of my games that is in a way the most vanilla of the role-playing games. It's Follow, which is just a very straightforward, your characters working together to accomplish a quest. And that quest could be a whole variety of things. Maybe you're trying to slay a dragon. Maybe you're overthrowing a tyrannical overlord. Maybe you're researchers trying to cure a disease. Doesn't matter. It fits a whole range of genres and settings and cyberpunk and space and fantasy and modern day, whatever, it doesn't matter. The structure works in all those cases. I'm taking that and I'm making a free version that anyone can just download and play. Because I realized I didn't, back when I used to put out like Mage Masterminds, like adventures, I had like a free adventure people could download to kind of show what I thought was a good adventure design. And I was like, oh my God, I don't have that for GMless games. That's stupid. So soon, by the end of the month, actually, if you go to lamemage.com, you will see like, hey, you can just get this for free. Check it out. And that will be, in a way, the most similar to D&D in the sense that you will have a character playing together to accomplish a quest. The other really nice thing about all these games is that they're genuinely short. Playing like one session, you could, like, if some people can't make it, you could be like, hey, let's play Kingdom. Let's get together and make this thing, and we'll just do it all in one night and have a good time. You're not committing to like a huge investment in the future. Flip side, Kingdom specifically, now has a mode where you can play it as a campaign. We've played Kingdom. I think our longest Kingdom game is now like 100 sessions, making multiple eras of the same community and seeing how it's changed over time. So I guess that is not exactly an answer to your question, but if you want weird, Microscope, and also in this world, but Microscope is the one that you're going to go like, whoa, what is that? If you want to be like, hey, I want to role play characters, but I want to do it, this whole story games thing you were talking about, this like, hey, from the point of view of what my character wants, and you want to just, you just enjoy the role play. If you're the kind of person who plays D&D, you're like, yeah, the fighting is not my favorite part. I want to role play my character. I enjoy the role playing elements. Follow might be an awesome thing for you. And again, that will be free and you can just download it and play it and see what you think. Caveat though, 100%, if you come from a background, you played a lot of D&D, it can be a big shift. It can be more difficult to take someone who's an experienced gamer playing traditional games and switch to story games than it could be for someone who's never played any of these games, has no idea what it is, and they just sit down and play and say, hey, it's like we're in a movie. What do you do? And I generally don't think that everybody should be playing one kind of game or the other, right? They're different activities, much like saying that someone who enjoys basketball should not necessarily go and play baseball, right? Like they're both fine. They can coexist, right?
And where should people go to? So we've mentioned lamemage.com a bunch of times, but
Yes.
is there other places that people should find the games, or yourself, or
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because that's a very good thing. We started a new thing. We started a little tiny subreddit for GMless games, because there wasn't one. So it's just our GMless. And so far it has been lovely. It's been pretty low key. And it's been basically like, people talk about GMless games on like the big RPG chats, but usually it's like the vast majority of people on there don't have interest in that, and they don't have as much experience with it. But on our GMless, it's basically just people who play these games a lot and have very good thoughts about them. So it's a really good place to kind of like, hey, I want to talk about this, without people being like, nah, I should play D&D instead. And also we have the particular thing we've got going right now, which I'm loving, is we've got too often people are like, hey, I want to try a game like this. What should I play? What should I dip my feet into? We have a whole thread that's a discussion and recommendation list of like, we're trying to catalog, like, here's the games, not just a list of games without any explanation, but a list and personal recommendations from people of like why I think this is a fun game, why I like it. Let me tell you about it. And that's been just lovely. Again, just beautiful recommendations from people, which is quite nice. So, and hopefully that's gonna be an ongoing thing. We're gonna keep building that for hopefully years to come. I don't know.
Oh, that's awesome. I'll include the links to all those down in the description of the podcast, or on the YouTube video, what have you. I ask everybody this question at the end, and we're all over the place already, but
yeah, we could go for 5 more hours.
Yeah, for sure. But I'll put this out there. You've spoken with a lot of people over the years on games, and like I said, the West Marshes gets talked about a lot. Microscope was a big hit, so you've talked with people about games a whole lot, and I'm sure a lot of the questions I've asked are questions you've been asked a bunch of other times before. What is a question that you're often hoping people come and ask you? What's a topic that you would like to be able to talk about more? And I know I'm truncating you down and saying, yeah, bring it up, and then we're only gonna be able to talk for a moment or two. But what's something that you wish you wish people would bring up more, and you have a spot to, share it with the world?
I mean, I think it's the most obvious thing ever, but I keep finding this is to be true, that it's the what's the virtue of GMless games? Like, what's the virtue of this kind of play, this kind of group play? I forget how many people in the world have no idea what I'm talking about, even in game circles, right? Like there's this other trend. It's a whole nother thing, but there's this other trend now where people are kind of inventing a different species of GMless game. They're coming at it from the other side. They're saying, what if I just take D&D or any game of the GM and I replace the GM with like oracles? So they're like, there's this other tribe of GMless, and they don't think they know about us. So like, I think it's like they're reinventing the wheel from a different direction. They're taking a GM game and removing the GM instead of building a GMless game from the ground up. And it's fascinating.
I see a lot of them taking that from the solo RPG world,
and the solo thing is a totally different species as well. Okay,
but they're all kind of intermixed in the same way.
But I think it's weird how people are not fully interrogating the differences. Like, if I'm playing solo, I have no need to agree with anybody, right? It's a totally different beast. So to say, like, I think to me the biggest thing about a GMless game is that you do have to, as a group, come to an agreement. And that's the hardest thing in the world, getting different people to like something together and agree. And since solo GMs or solo games simply do not have that aspect to them, they're a wildly different beast, right? And like with different issues entirely. So I feel like when people are like, oh, GMless and solo, I'm like, totally different, like not related, like, come on, like.
We should definitely actually have another conversation at another time, if you're available for it, about just that, because I hadn't thought of it. I didn't have it in my list of things to come up, but yeah, I think the difference between solo and GMless, and even where things are going in the future with, like, people are bringing AI into stuff.
Oh my God, yeah, we could spend all day. Yes, yes.
How all that merges into how gaming may go in the future. I think that'd be an interesting conversation. So if you're up for that,
I'm game. I'm game. Stay tuned
right.
for part 2 or whatever.
All right, awesome. I won't take up too much more of your time because I try to keep these around an hour for you and also for those who are listening. But thanks so much for coming on. This was a lot of
So
fun.
much fun. So much fun.
And,
yeah.
And yeah, I think we definitely have to go back. There's a lot of things where it's just fun to talk with people.
There's so much to talk about. Yeah.
And hey, enjoy the same thing. So
enjoy your vacation.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to be near the holy site. I'm going through Wisconsin. I don't think I'm actually going to go down to Lake Geneva, but I might.
Nice. Nice.
So I'll be near. I'll be feeling the vibes of that maybe.
Most people probably don't know that the early Lake Geneva conventions were being hosted in the same building as what's the Playboy Resort or whatever.
Oh,
strange times. Yeah, like the parts of history we don't talk about. Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for coming on, and we'll have to do this again very soon.
Lovely. Looking forward to it.
All right, folks, that's going to wrap up this episode of the Red Caps podcast. I hope you enjoyed, you learned something, and that you were eager to come back for more. www.theredcaps.net has all the links to all the ways to contact me, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you ever so much for listening. Never let your caps dry out. Stay safe. Have fun. We'll talk again soon. Take care.